Good evening and welcome to the special meeting of the Board of Education for January 29th, 2024. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Would. Mrs. Acosta.
Here.
Mrs. Bradford.
Here.
Mrs. Burton.
Here.
Mrs. Frank.
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Here.
Mrs. Bonnefield is here. President Johnson.
Here, we do have a quorum. Thank you again for tuning in. This is a special meeting, and it's for the election of officers for this year, so we anticipate it's going to be a relatively short meeting. The process that we will go through is we will take nominations from the floor. The nominations do not have to be second. I will call for nominations once all nominations for that position have been voiced, and then I will close the nominations and we will vote. We will do that for the president, the secretary, and the vice president, and then there will be a motion to appoint our treasurer. So that's a process that we'll go through. So at this time, I will open nominations for president. Are there any nominations?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Burton.
I nominate Karen Bradford for president of the school board. I think you have done a superb job off and on for many years. But at the same time, it is good to move things around a bit. And I don't think we should just necessarily just rotate all the way up and down tables, but rather go to folks that have specific strengths for specific positions. And I believe Karen has done a great job as vice president and has stepped in at times when you have had to be absent. So I have confidence that she could do a good job in that role, and I would nominate Karen as president.
Thank you, Ms. Burton. Are there any other nominations for president? Hearing none, the nominations for president are closed. One nomination is Mrs. Bradford. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Yes. Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes. The nomination is confirmed. Congratulations, Mrs. Bradford.
Thank you.
We will move on now to nominations for vice president. I will open those nominations. Do I hear a nomination for vice president?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Frank.
I think that it would be great for this will be Mrs. Bradford's first time coming in as president, so I would love it. I think you've done a great job as being president, and just to be able to be there with her as she steps into this role, into this leadership role, to be able to support her and help her and back her up. I think your wisdom and your experience would be a great benefit to have on the board as vice president.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Any other nominations for vice president? Hearing none, nominations for vice president is closed. Mr. Johnson has been nominated. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
I would. Let's see, that was, sorry, Mrs. Acosta. I'm going to go with you. Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes. All right. Mr. Johnson is nominated or elected for vice president. Thank you. I will now open the nominations for secretary. Nominations, please.
President Johnson.
Mrs. Jarvis.
In the interest of bringing in fresh new faces into our office roles, I would like to nominate Madeline Acosta for the position of secretary.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Any other nominations for secretary? Seeing none, the nominations for secretary are closed. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes. Congratulations, Mrs. Acosta. At this time, I need a motion to appoint our treasurer.
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that Allison Smith be appointed treasurer of the Livonia Public Schools School District for 2024 until the next annual election of officers.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to appoint Allison Smith as our treasurer.
Mrs. Secretary.
Hello, Mrs. Smith. All right. So we have a motion. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
I would love to. Let's see. I will go first. Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you, Mrs. Smith. All right, that is all the business that will come before the board in the special meeting, so we are adjourned. And we will be back in just a few minutes for our regular meeting.
Good evening and welcome to the regular meeting of the Livonia Board of Education for January 29th, 2024. And let's see. Oh, Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Yes, President Bradford. Mrs. Bradford, President Bradford. Oh, I went backwards. I'm already starting.
It's okay. It's hard. It's not.
Mrs. Burton,
Here.
Mrs. Frank,
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Here.
Mrs. Bonifield,
Here.
Mr. Johnson,
Here.
Mrs. Acosta, here, President Bradford.
Here.
And
Okay,
that's
we have a
quorum.
quorum. All right, Mrs. Burton, would you lead us in the pledge?
Yes.
please?
I pledge
Allegiance
allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Again, good evening, everybody. If this looks different to you, it is. We just had our election of officers a few minutes ago, and we have changed seats. So we have some new people in the seats today. So I am currently the president. Mrs. Acosta is our new secretary, and Mr. Johnson will be our vice president. And of course, Mrs. Smith will continue as our treasurer. So I just want to take time to thank everybody on the board for trusting me into this role, and I'm really looking forward to it. And we work as a team, so we're all in this together, but I appreciate sitting in this role, and I will do the best I can throughout the year here for you. So if you'd like to follow along with tonight's meeting and you're joining us in person, you can go out the doors and to the left and find a copy of the agendas on the table. If you're joining us from home, you can go to our LPS website at www.livoniapublicschools.org, click on the school board tab, go down to meeting information and find the meeting agendas, and then click on today's date, and you'll find our agenda for this evening. If you're here in person this evening and you wish to come before the board to speak at audience communications, please fill out a blue slip. I don't see anybody handy right now. We do have one blue slip, so we'll be ready when audience communications comes along. So thank you. Tonight is a regular meeting, or what we call a voting meeting. If you've tuned in to watch this meeting, you may notice that there's not a lot of discussion happening on these items. That's because we have seen and discussed these items multiple times prior to this meeting, mainly at our study sessions and at our committee, the whole meetings. If you wish to hear more regarding some of these items, we ask that you go back and watch the COW meetings and the previous meetings, and you'll find a much richer discussion and many questions. So our meetings, COW meetings, are recorded and they can be found on our website and via YouTube. One other item that I would like to briefly mention is one of our community with characters traits, respect. Our students learn, model, and follow this trait every day at school. Our board also follows and models this important trait here at the table. We do not always agree with one another, but we have very differing opinions at times, but we all treat each other with respect, and for our differences and the way we convey them to each other. So you have our word that this board will treat everyone in this room with respect, and that we ask that you do the same for us. And with that, we will move on to item, let's see, where are we going here? Item number 3, communications, and it's item A, recognition of National School Board Month. Well, this is wonderful. And, all right, we have Mrs. Jenkins here to help us along on this.
Thank you. Good evening, President Bradford. I'm going to have to get used to that. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Members of the board, Superintendent Elquist. This is always one of my favorite board presentations of the school year. I'm honored to recognize the Board of Education during this School Board Recognition Month, Each January, Livonia Public Schools join the more than 500 school districts across the state of Michigan to offer sincere thanks to the 7 members of their boards of education. And we're doing so tonight with our local Board of Education. School Board Appreciation Month is a designation issued by the Michigan Association of School Boards as a way to honor and thank the more than 4,000 elected community leaders statewide who serve on local school boards. Here in LPS, we know that we have the absolute best board in the state of Michigan. So I'm going to brag on you a little bit here for a few minutes, if you don't mind. Each of you represent your constituents in a professional, thoughtful, and caring manner. Whether you are participating in furthering your own professional development through MASB coursework, or showing up even on weekends and snowy evenings to the many, many school events that are happening around the district, you are shining examples of a high-functioning and dedicated board, and we appreciate you so very much. Each of you approach your role as a board member with so much purpose, passion, and pride. You clearly define the board's roles and responsibilities and work closely in a trusting relationship with the district administration. The intent and the result of your work remains constant: what is best for kids. Our district is continuing on an upward trajectory in areas such as our fiscal management, facility improvements that are made possible through 2 successful bond issues over the past decade, and our continued focus on bolstering student achievement for our more than 13,000 students. You support the district's 4 priority areas of student achievement, increasing employee capacity, financial responsibility, and fostering a supportive climate and culture in our district. You truly are champions for LPS and positive role models for all that we do here in our district for our students, families, and our staff. We talk a lot about our points of pride in Livonia Public Schools. You are one of the many points of pride. Your designation as an honor board over the past several years shows that you are dedicated not only as a group to learning and growing in your role, but also as individuals by completing the coursework that is offered through the MASB. We know, and we would like everyone to know, the amount of time and effort you put into studying the issues that come before you, how you respectfully discuss each issue and find the best path forward for our district. We are fortunate to have you as thought partners and advocates for our students, families, and our staff. I could go on and on about you collectively and individually, but suffice it to say that I speak on behalf of our district administration, our entire staff, our students, and our families when I say that we appreciate the important work that you do for LPS. At this time, I would like to present each of you with a certificate of recognition that is from the Michigan Association of School Boards. You can add this to your collection. The certificate reads, Certificate of Appreciation for your dedication to our children and public education in Michigan. And that is signed by the MASB President Kathleen Moore and Executive Director Don Rotruba. If I may.
Yes, please. Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Stacy.
Also, we've included a proclamation in your packet signed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer and a special resolution that was adopted by the Wayne RESA Board of Education. And I would like to read that resolution that the Wayne County RESA Board adopted at their December 20th meeting. Wayne County Regional Educational Services Agency Board of Education, Local School District Board of Education Recognition Resolution for the month of January 2024. Whereas the Boards of Education of the 33 constituent school districts of Wayne County promote quality education for every child attending their schools, and whereas these exceptional public servants demonstrate enthusiasm to their duty and voluntarily contribute countless hours of service on behalf of the students of Wayne County, the educators that support the students daily, and their communities. And whereas Wayne County school boards are resilient advocates for the needs of students in their communities and with policymakers in Lansing and Washington. And whereas Wayne County school boards are committed to advancing the student achievement and well-being in the schools and communities they serve. And whereas Wayne County school boards understand the importance of access, opportunity, equity, and excellence in education for its students, and recognize that a quality education is the most important factor in the success of our communities, state, and our country. And whereas local control continues to play a vital role in the success of public education, and whereas the mission of public schools is to meet the diverse educational needs of all children and to empower them to become informed and productive contributors to society and an ever-changing world. And whereas the state of Michigan and the State Board of Education have declared January 2024 as School Board Recognition Month, and whereas School Board Recognition Month is an ideal time to recognize and celebrate the Wayne County residents serving on school district governing boards of education who help guide the education of pupils in pre-kindergarten through grade 12 and who prepare these pupils for global competitiveness. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Wayne County Regional Educational Services Agency Board of Education, in the spirit of the School Board Recognition Month, recognizes and celebrates the contributions and leadership of the Wayne County School Boards of Education. Presented and adopted December 20th, 2023, signed by Wayne RESA President Linda Jackson, Vice President James Petrie, Treasurer Danielle Funderburg, Secretary Mary Blackman, and Trustee James Berry. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins.
And I know we have a very small crowd here tonight, but first I would like to turn it over to Superintendent Elquist for a few words.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Jenkins. You did an absolutely beautiful job capturing the role of our board and the impact that they have on our district. So thank you for those remarks. And I will just add personally that it is not only a privilege, but truly a joy to work with each and every one of you. In my role, I have truly always felt in my 9 years as superintendent that we have been a team of 8. And I know that we work hard to work in that team and to support one another, to ask questions, to be thought partners, to think deeply about the children and the staff that we serve. And I am continuously impressed by the work that you do as volunteers. You're working truly from your heart with a dedication for our students and our district. And your love for our district shows in so many ways. So we are grateful. So thank you to each and every one of you.
Thank you.
And I was going to wrap it up saying that we have a very small crowd this evening, but if you could join me in a round of applause for each of our Summer Board of Education members.
Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins, and thank you, Mrs. Oquist, for those words. Would anybody like to say anything? Mrs. Burton.
Get the microphone on here. Thank you very much. That was very humbling and very, very embarrassing, and but it was very, very sweet. It is truly a joy to work with the team of coworkers and folks who I now call very sincere friends in this room. It is a rare thing, and we've said this before, but it bears repeating. All of us have gone to a lot of conferences and worked with other board members from across the state. And when I first began in this role, I just assumed that most other districts were pretty much like Livonia, just a little bigger or a little smaller. And that's not necessarily the case in many, many instances. This district is truly blessed to have a Board of Education that, as President Bradford stated at the beginning, we may or may not always agree with one another, but we treat one another with respect. We have processes to get our work done and to get it done thoughtfully and to think and talk deeply about issues, but to come to consensus on issues. so that we don't have controversial decisions very often, because we can meet in the middle and come to consensus, or what we learned early on is I can live with it, because we don't always get our way in every issue. But to work with this group of folks on this Board of Education, with our superintendent, who I hold in the highest of esteem, and our cabinet members, who I so highly respect and have come to love as dear friends, we are truly blessed in this district to have such a large team to work together toward the good of our students. We just recently had Mrs. Wozniak retire and had Teresa join our team, and thank you so very much for continuing to keep us all held together, to keep all of our paperwork and all of our information together to make this part of it all look easy. It's very appreciated, and you have hit the ground flying, not just running. So, but thank you very much for your kindness. It's sincerely appreciated.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. That was well said. Anybody else?
How do you
No,
add to that?
I don't think we can add to that. I think you speak for the whole board. That was lovely. Thank you. All right. All right, moving on. We are going to 3B, the district update from the superintendent.
Thank you, President Bradford. We will pop that up on the screen, and we'll share some highlights from this past month with you. So we'll start out with kindergarten, and we have Mrs. Merkel's class here at Kennedy. They were spent some time learning how to act out the story they've been reading. As you know, that's an important skill as our little ones begin to comprehend what they're reading. So they're retelling the story and being sure to include all of the supporting details. And here we have our Family 2 students, so that would be grades 3 and 4 at Webster Elementary. Here they're working on a STEM activity and reading about different types of bird beaks and their functions. So they made their own beaks to test and figure out why the different types of beaks have different functions. Neat activity. And we have other second grade friends here at Rosedale Elementary learning about erosion during a recent activity. And we have Mrs. Ruman's class at Cleveland who worked on their first data day. Students surveyed and collected information from many classmates about their favorite ice cream, made a graph and answered questions using the data they collected. So as you know, that's part of their math curriculum, and I can't think of a more flavorful topic to ask about. And so we have here, we'll move right up the grades to our pre-med students at the Livonia Career Technical Center. So here they were learning about wound care, and they actually created those wounds. So they used, and I don't recall what the material was, but they used a special type of material and created the wounds, and then they had to learn how to treat what looked like some pretty realistic wounds. I saw a number of pictures from the activity, and they were very lifelike. Here we have Mrs. Corey. As you know, she is our curriculum coordinator at the elementary level in our academic services department. So she was working with one of her teacher partners in Mrs. Thim's class on an ELA activity called Close Reading. And so she was in the classroom and doing some model teaching in the classroom at Cooper. And I know many of you were able to join in the fun. We had a great time at the annual chili cook-off. You'll see in the middle there, Matt Parnell was a Cooper dad. He was the big winner of the chili cook-off. So Cooper will receive a $500 gift from the Livonia Kiwanis Club and Frost Middle School. And that table was hosted by two of our wonderful staff members at Frost. They won the best decorated table. And then you see on the left there a number of members of the LPS Education Foundation, including a couple folks here at this table, had a chance to enjoy the chili cook-off. Always a great event hosted by our wonderful PTSA council. And here we have the Japanese celebration. I believe it's Mochusiku. Is that correct, Suki? Mochusuki. At Nijiiro was held just about a week ago. And so this was a wonderful activity to celebrate the new year. And mochi is a sweet rice, and the students and guests pound the rice, and then that rice is used to make the mochi. And at Nijiro, there were almost 100 parent volunteers there that day. They were making the mochi, they were helping with different students pound the rice. And the members of the Japanese consulate were also there, and they were doing some presentations in the class as well. So you see Mrs. Acosta there. I know we had members of our cabinet team, Mrs. Keats and Mr. Abate, who spent time. And I thankfully had a couple of very strong helpers when I had a chance to hold the hammer. So great opportunity to welcome many visitors into Nijiro, and a very special day for that school community. One of the favorites, I'm sure many of you remember those days of the Wax Museum, whether it was you or maybe one of your kiddos, but Hoover Elementary has had a long, rich history of holding a wax museum, and the fourth graders spend time really looking into a historical figure, and then they portray that figure at the wax museum. And so as you walk up to the students, they will tell a little bit about themselves, and they have a display that goes along with it. So I know a number of our schools participate in activities such as these, and so you see some probably familiar faces from history up there. I don't know how many of you have met Cooper. Cooper is the Livonia Police Department's therapy dog, would you say? Yep. And so Cooper spent some time recently at a number of our schools, and Cooper is a golden doodle, and the handler is Lieutenant Hayes. And so I will tell you, anytime Cooper visits one of our schools, it is a highlight. And recently, we were treated to a wonderful celebration and presentation by the Bel Canto Choir from Franklin. As you know, they normally come here prior to the holidays, but because we changed when the common summative assessments were being done, they were not able to come at their normal time. And so they traveled on their tour throughout the district that day and visited. I know Emerson and Cooper and Hayes and a senior living home, and the senior living home was not central office. That was a separate stop. And so we had a chance to have them here, and Mrs. Olson and her crew, and many thank you to the Bel Canto Choir for the absolutely beautiful treat that we had. I know, Mr. Johnson, you were here, and we were absolutely wowed by the sights and sounds of this great group. And thank you to all of the parent volunteers who made it possible for our students to get to each of these sites by serving as drivers. And students here we have at Riley Upper Elementary shared some of their dreams inspired by Martin Luther King, and they had a wonderful hallway display sharing the dream that they have for their school, their community, or the world around them. Lots of Lions Pride. If you took a look at social media last week, you could not help but see many of our students and staff proudly wearing their Honolulu blue. Over the past several days, we had students from across the district in these next couple of slides. And I know that pride was felt all the way to San Francisco, and aren't we proud of our hometown heroes and the amazing season that they had. So just adorable, all of those proud Lions fans sharing their pride for the city and for a great team. Speaking of a great team, we have the Franklin Unified team here. Unified basketball is back in full swing, as we shared with you last week. So they had a game versus Plymouth Canton, and I know we've shared that schedule with you. If you're able to join us for a game, the season is underway, and as you know, it is a wonderful opportunity for our students to come together in support of our unified teams. We have a few more here. We have Frost versus Garfield playing at Churchill. The Western Wayne Skills Center and Frost Center squared off last Friday in a great basketball game hosted at Churchill and attended by many of our Churchill students and staff. And here we have I'm going to actually pop down to that on my own computer. We have our robotics team here. They are gearing up. They are in season, and so we're going to share a few highlights there with you. We have the Livonia Warriors and Tyros. They hosted their first official kickoff to the season in their new robotics space at LCTC a bit earlier this month. They utilized the Flex classrooms, as you can see here, to watch the first robotics kickoff video and game reveal, and the game reveal is a big time to let them know what they have in store for them this season. And then they have the full-size field at our new robotics center to play the game with humans to see how the robots would move around the game pieces. So they are ready to build and play crescendo. Here we go. All right, we have a number of kudos to share. We have our Kappa Acting Award nominations. So congratulations to some of our Kappa students for their Sutton Foster Award nominations. Outstanding Performer in a Leading Role, Callum Johnson as Sweeney Todd. Outstanding Performer in a Leading Role, Caroline Ronayne as Mrs. Lovett. And Callum and Caroline will now move on to the workshop and audition weekend in Detroit and the showcase in East Lansing. So that's a pretty special honor. Here we recently held regionals. We did not hold regionals, but our POM teams attended regionals, and congratulations to Stevenson and Franklin for qualifying in Division I for the state championship. And here we have Skylar Samansky received the Rotary Club's Vocational Service Student Award. I know Mr. Etu was able to attend that Rotary meeting, and here you see Dr. Haas presenting this award to a really amazing and impressive student. And so Skylar, I believe, is in 2 programs? Criminal Justice and Medical. So that is somewhat unusual, so way to go, Skylar, and congratulations on that special recognition. And speaking of special recognitions, we have the state's Music Educator of the Year, our music content area leader and music teacher at Randolph, Eric Botorf. So you may remember meeting Mr. Botorf when we were at Randolph last year. He was part of their school improvement team that presented to us. So he was honored at the 2023 as the Michigan Music Teacher of the Year by MMEA. So this is a very prestigious award, and the nominations come from his peers, and it was a unanimous decision by the committee. So congratulations to Mr. Botorf. We also have a very talented young composer. Isabel is a 4th grader at Hoover, and she premiered her piece, The Lion's Roar, at a Young Composers Concert on Saturday at the Michigan Music Conference. She was one of 14 young composers invited to join, and you see her pictured with her very proud music teacher, Mrs. Amy West. So congratulations, Isabel. And we have a few more on from our music teachers who were able to share their talents at a conference. You'll see Mrs. Grammatico here, music teacher at Roosevelt. She gave 2 presentations at the music conference this past weekend. She had a very popular presentation called Parachute Play with Purpose. Got people up and moving, and she collaborated with other educators from Wayne Westland schools and Ferndale schools. So thank you so much, Mrs. Grammatico, for sharing your talents with educators from across the state. And finally, from the music conference, we have Ian Boynton, music teacher at Cleveland Elementary. He led 3 sessions on music technology to improve music instruction. And Matt Van Ham, who you know is the band director at Churchill High School, ran a meet and greet session as part of the mentoring program that he helps coordinate for the state organization. So very impressive to have so many of our music educators participate in their state conference and to be presenters at that conference. So we are so very proud of them. And speaking of wonderful folks on a mission, recently Mr. Wenstrom returned from a very special trip to Guatemala. He was part of a memory mission project sponsored by Life Touch, and he took part in building a schoolhouse in Guatemala. And they also had a chance to take portraits of the children in the area, get them developed, and present them to the students, many of whom who have never seen themselves in a portrait. So they were able to take the pictures, get them developed, and bring them back to the children by time they were, by time they'd completed work on the school. So a wonderful opportunity, and we appreciate Mr. Wenstrom's continued community service efforts. So a couple quick mark your calendars, and I will wrap it up. Speaking of our talented kiddos, we have Shrek the Musical coming at the end of February. Always popular, the 23rd, 24th, and 25th at Churchill High School. As you know, that QR code, either on here or on the website, gets you right to the ticket sales, and you will be able to choose your own seat. And then we have Freaky Friday, March 15th, 16th, and 17th. Will be presented by the Franklin Players. Both, I think, will be exciting for our community to attend. And Wednesday night, we have our Livonia Career Technical Center Preview Night. So prospective students and families can learn about many amazing programs at LCTC. This schedule is available on the front of our website as well as on the LCTC website. So there is an introduction, and then many sessions that parents and students can attend to learn more about the offerings at LCTC. Tomorrow night is our Stevenson ninth grade preview night, which was rescheduled from last week. And finally, a reminder to check your backpack, your e-backpack mail. As you know, we utilize this feature on the website as the one-stop shopping for families who are looking for activities for their children. So thank you so much, President Bradford, for letting me share a few highlights with you from across the district.
You're welcome. That was wonderful. There's so many things going on, and it's great to see them. All right, we're going to move on to item 3C, written communications. I do not have any written communications. Does anybody? Okay, moving on to 3D, response to prior audience communications. I also do not have any of that. Does anybody have any? Okay. Moving on to 3E, audience communications. Audience communications is a time set aside for the board to listen to the concerns of the community. It's not a question and answer period, but rather a time set aside for us to listen thoughtfully to anyone's concerns. Each speaker has up to 3 minutes to speak. We have a timekeeper. Mr. Johnson will be our timekeeper. When you hear the tone go off, we ask that you politely finish and wrap up your comments. We'll listen to audience communications for 15 minutes. After that, because we have our business meeting to conduct, we'll listen to the remainder of the communications right before hearing from board members. The board is responsible for 3 main roles: hiring and evaluating our superintendent, adopting policies that gives the district direction to set the priorities and to achieve its goals, and also adopting and overseeing our budget. If your comments pertain to these 3 roles, you will expect to hear a response from members of our board. If your comments pertain to anything else, or what we call the, quote, day-to-day operations of the district, you should expect to hear back from our superintendent or a member of our cabinet team. All right, and with that, I have one slip, and then we have Jackie Thomason. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And there's a little button right there. If you press that and it comes on green, that'll start your microphone.
Just tap it.
Yeah, tap it.
There you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Hi,
Thank
everyone.
you. Hi there.
I'm Jackie Thomason. I've met some of you before at various events around town. I'm the district director for State Senator Mary Kavanaugh. Just want to start, I don't have any concerns, only comments. I thought the presentation was amazing. I learned so much about what you guys are doing here, and I was happy to be able to learn more about what you have going on. I just wanted to come today to share that the senator is having a coffee hour just across the street from here at the firehouse with the Livonia Fire Chief, Robert Jennison. That'll be on Friday, February 23rd from 2 to 3 p.m. So we encourage anyone who wants to come and learn more about what's going on in Lansing and other events the senator has coming up to definitely stop by. You don't have to RSVP or anything. And I also have some business cards that I'll leave out on the front table in case you guys want to, coordinate any events with the senator's office. We are planning some March's Reading Month stops as well at some of the local elementary schools and middle schools nearby. So, you'll probably have some photos of us in one of these in March or April, because she'll be there. Other than that, we have a health fair coming up on March 9th. That'll be at Greater Grace in Detroit, but it's open for all of her constituents. She represents Northwest Detroit, Redford, Livonia, Farmington, and Farmington Hills. And I will let you guys get back to your meeting, but it was, great to meet some of you before and now, and I'll be back again sometime soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for being here. All right, moving on to item 4, our consent agenda. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Acosta.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the following consent agenda items as recommended by the superintendent. 5A, minutes of the regular meeting of December 18, 2023.
Support.
All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Burton for the consent agenda. Is there any member of the board that would wish to remove any items from the consent agenda this evening? Okay. Then we can go ahead and Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll?
Yes. Mrs. Acosta, yes. Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield,
Yes.
President Bradford.
Yes. Motion carried. All right. That brings us to, we're going to go down to item 6, business matters. We're going to go ahead with 6A. The approval of HVAC upgrades for Holmes and Emerson. May I have a motion,
Give me a
please?
second here. For some reason, you have to stop that. Okay.
May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mr. Johnson.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase and installation of HVAC equipment from Engineered Comfort Systems located in Taylor, Michigan, for a total amount of $392,569, which includes hard construction and contingency.
Support.
Oh, jeez. We have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Burton. We will be hearing from Mr. Francis.
Good evening, President Bradford.
Thank you.
I'm going to screw that one up a couple of times. I'm just going to tell you at some point. But it sounds really good. This is something, I know we discussed this at the study session a couple weeks ago, and there's a little more detail that I want to thank Mrs. Smith for filling in for me last Monday night that we were talked about this. Essentially, this is, we're going to do through the sinking fund a little additional HVAC work in these 2 buildings. They have a system in the art room at Holmes that ties into the wood shop room, neither of which we originally put air conditioning in when we were running through that bond work. Same goes with the woods room over at Emerson. So what we're doing now is going back into that. As we discussed at the study session, I'm sure again at the committee of the whole, that was a conscious effort based upon sort of the use of those rooms with regard to special filtration systems, et cetera, because of the wood shop. But in hindsight, we do recognize that those are classrooms. We said we're putting air conditioning in classrooms, so we press forward with this. The plan here is to have this be summer work and to be ready for the start of the school year in August. However, I just have a caveat, as we all know, sometimes there are lead time issues with equipment, et cetera, that could always slow us down. So I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, so I do want to put that caveat in there. And again, as mentioned, this is a sinking fund item.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Francis. Do we have any questions or comments? Mrs. Burton.
Mr. Francis, just to clarify, initially we decided not to do that because of of the particulates that were floating around in those rooms and whether or not we were gonna be spreading them out through the filtration system. And if I understand correctly, basically what's happened is in the other art or woods rooms, we have not seen that to be a problem, and therefore we're going ahead with this now. Is that correct?
To a degree, to be clear, they're also hooked together at Frost between the art room and the wood shop. And I can't give you 100% explanation as to why we went in that rooftop unit. It's different than a regular classroom. It doesn't just have the individual vertical unit ventilator. It's run off an RTU that's up on the rooftop unit. So with the art room at Frost, it did actually connect into the wood shop, which is then we reviewed that and said, okay, we've already done it at one place. We need to ensure we have the proper filtration system on it, and we'll just do it at all 3 middle schools so that they're all equal.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Johnson for approval of HVAC upgrades for Holmes and Emerson, seconded by Mrs. Burton. Would you take the roll, please, Mrs. Acosta?
Yes. Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, motion carries. That brings us to item 6B, the approval of purchase of kitchen equipment. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of kitchen equipment from Stratford Smith, Inc., located in Madison Heights, Michigan, for a total cost of $32,020.
Support.
All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis for the approval of purchase of kitchen equipment, and we're going to hear from Mr. Francis.
Thank you again. This is a purchase for, through the food service department, and it is generally, the majority of which is being paid for through a grant. And we have a refrigerator and 4 milk coolers, and those will be going to several of our buildings. We've got let me double check here, make sure I say this correctly. We have the refrigerator going to Holmes, and the 4 milk coolers are being dispersed, 1 each at Cleveland, Grant, Nigiero, and Webster. So again, based upon the grant's rules, we can only use those dollars on the actual equipment, which is why I do note that the freight and installation will be paid out of the LPS Food Service Fund.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Francis. Any
welcome.
questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval of purchase of kitchen equipment. Mrs. Acosta, would you take the roll, please?
Yes. Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, that motion carries. All right, we're moving on to item 6C, the approval of LCTC 61C1 grant purchase. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of 2 Suzy S2000 tetherless simulators, mannequins, from Gomard, located in Miami, Florida, for a total cost of $69,054, and 2 SAM auscultation mannequins with Wi-Fi sim scopes from Cardionics, located in Webster, Texas, for a total cost of $27,500. The total cost for these 4 equipment items is $96,554.
Support.
Thank you. We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the approval of LCTC 61C1 grant purchase, and we're going to hear from Mr. Etu.
Thank you, President Bradford. That was a perfect description all around, but this
It
is
sure
part
was.
of, it was. This is part of the CTE equipment purchase grant from 61C for the Livonia Career Technical Center. They were awarded approximately $152,777, in which these 4 pieces of equipment account for about $96,000. The remaining balance of that 61C fund or award or grant will be used for other items that don't meet the threshold of the Board of Education. So I'm looking for a recommendation for those purchases.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions or comments? Mrs. Bonnefield?
I would just like to say this is a very exciting purchase all around. We've heard a lot about it, seen a lot about this. Not only did we, were we lucky enough to get the grant, our staff went after that and was able to receive the grant. And to top it off, we are providing with our kids with really state-of-the-art, very impressive, top-of-the-line equipment through the grant, which we would not be able to otherwise provide to them. So this is exciting all around for all of our students that are going to be able to utilize this.
It's outstanding knowing that this equipment's going to go into our new LCTC medical simulation lab as well.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Yes, I have to agree. This is really exciting. We got just some photographs in our packets, and they looked really, really cool. I think the kids are going to enjoy these, and it just says a lot about what we're providing for our kids in the LCTC program. So very excited, and want to thank those who wrote this grant, who go after these grants, because it takes a lot of time to fill out these grants, and boy, does it reap great rewards when we receive them. They're great to have. So thank you to all those who work diligently on those.
Mrs. Bradford? President Bradford?
Yes, Mrs. Burton.
Just a quick comment. For those who may not have who've tuned in for some of our previous meetings, what's exciting about this specific equipment is that it can simulate, what is it? I believe it's hundreds of different injuries or diseases that can be programmed into it, and then our students can figure out, what that disease or injury actually is and how to treat it properly, which is just equipment that is almost unheard of at a high school level. This is really more college level equipment, but to have this opportunity for our pre-medical students is really exciting. So it's equipment. I look forward to seeing it once it arrives.
Absolutely.
So do I. Okay. All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, seconded by Mrs. Bonnefield for the approval of LCTC 61C1 grant purchase. May I have Mrs. Acosta? What am I saying? Would you please take the roll?
Yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Join with me.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, motion carried. Moving on to 6D, the approval of early middle college programming. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve a collaborative agreement with Schoolcraft College to establish an early middle college program.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Acosta, for the approval of early middle college programming, and we're going to hear from Mrs. O'Brien. Hello, Mrs. O'Brien.
Hello, President Bradford.
Thank you.
Mr. Itu and myself are very happy to bring this to you, that we would like to enter into a collaborative agreement with Schoolcraft College in order to establish an early middle college program. Early middle college programming allows for a student to earn in 5 years a high school diploma and an associate degree or a certificate. We would like to begin our programming with students at the Livonia Career Technical Center, and specifically in our criminal justice program. Our students mostly attend Schoolcraft to attend the police academy from Livonia Career Tech, and this would provide them the opportunity to earn in 5 years their high school diploma and either an associate's in criminal justice, or they'll attend the police academy in that 5th year. The funds for this first year, Schoolcraft is going to be utilizing Section 61 grant funds to pay because they'd like to build a relationship with us, and then moving forward, we would continue to apply for grants ourselves, and then, possibly use general funds to continue this programming. But we'd like to just start with one program for the 24-25 school year.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments? Mrs. Frank?
Thank you. This might be too early, but is there any, do you think there will be any ramifications if Michigan does go to a 2-year free community college? Or is it too early to tell? I know the governor had spoken about that. Is it kind of too early to tell about what those ramifications were, or that will take a lot longer? Do you have any?
Yeah, I
insight on
couldn't
that?
guess what that impact will be, but building forward, if that's what it does, then we'll make that plan. How's that impact on early middle college? How's that impact our students?
Yeah.
Mrs. O'Quist?
Thank you. I think it's a great question. Those same thoughts crossed my mind, having had so much conversation about dual enrollment and about early middle college. It certainly was part of the state. As we know, it will be now a multi-month process to go through to determine the budget allocations and appropriations to support either those programs or those that are brought forward by the House and Senate. So I think it's a great question that we'll be keeping our eye on, not only in the short term, but in the long term. So that is a costly program, and so we would be interested to see how that would fall into the budget priorities for the state of Michigan this year. And again, we know we're planning on using Section 61 funds for next year, and so I think that gives us a little bit of room and a little bit of time to determine if indeed that priority will go forward, and if it will also be part of the House and the House and Senate budgets in the spring. So great question, and we'll definitely keep our eye on it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments? Mrs. Jarvis?
Thank you, President Bradford.
You're
Mrs. O'Brien, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but would this then be open to students who are currently seniors in the criminal justice program at the Career Center? Or how would that work?
No, they would have to commit between their 9th grade and their 10th grade year.
Okay, so then walk me through that. Who would be doing what when next year?
So once we have applied and approved by the state and we have this agreement with Schoolcraft College, then we would be developing our programs of study. We'd be informing our parents who are going to be entering into our Career Technical Center and let them know that this is now a possibility for their students, and then they would have to make a determination if they're interested in doing that between their 9th and their 10th grade year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, President Bradford. Mrs. O'Brien, what happens if a student commits and they maybe get to the senior year and change their mind? What happens then? How would that look?
So our goal is to make sure that they have their Michigan Merit curriculum met in 4 years. The one caveat is they would need to be taking a math class in their senior year or their 4th year. Well, it's in their final year, and so if they had planned on moving that to their early middle college year, then they would need to make sure they have a math class both in their 12th grade and their 13th grade. So if they didn't continue on, they would need to have that math class.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a letter D, Colleen. A motion, thank you. We have a motion by Mrs. Burns, supported by Mrs. Acosta for the approval of early middle college programming. And Mrs. Acosta, will you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. Mrs. Benefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Bradford.
Yes, motion carries. All right, we're going to move on to, we have 7 instructional matters. We don't have any this evening, so we're going to move on to item 8, personnel matters. And we're going to go with 8A, teachers for approval. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Frank.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and offer employment for the 2023-2024 school year to the teachers listed on the attached document.
Support.
All right, we have support from Mrs. Acosta. We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Acosta for teachers for approval, and we're going to hear from Mr. Abadi.
Yes, thank you, President Bradford, and good evening, everybody. So we have a few teachers for approval here. Our new staff members we are presenting this evening fill several needs in special education and some elementary and secondary core instruction as well. They're all well qualified to fill these positions and have been fully vetted through our interview process. We are confident they will perform at a high level and represent Livonia Public Schools in a manner that is consistent with our shared vision and collective commitments. These positions have also been included in our 2023-2024 budget. We are pleased to be recommending these talented professionals to join our LPS family, and with your approval, we are excited to have them working with our students.
Thank you, Mr. Abadi. Any questions or comments? Okay, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Acosta for teachers for approval. Would you take the roll, please, Mrs. Acosta?
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield?
Yes.
President Bradford?
Yes, motion carries. All right, moving on to item 8B, teachers for tenure. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mrs. Acosta.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and acknowledge that tenure status has been granted to the following teachers effective on the respective date. Jean Darren, January 10th, 2024. Madison Lanzin, January 26th, 2024. Caitlin Oliver, January 26th, 2024. Kelly Sider, January 7th, 2024. Ewan Stevens, January 3rd, 2024. Gina Urso, January 23, 2024. Zachary Wilson, January 28, 2024.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Bonifield for teachers for tenure, and we're going to hear from Mrs. Keats.
Good evening, President Bradford.
Why, thank you.
Our teachers for tenure on this agenda have successfully completed the district's requirements for probationary teachers, including years of service, evaluations of overall performance, and documentation of student growth. We have carefully reviewed all supporting materials along with the recommendations of our building administration and have verified they should be granted tenure status with the Livonia Public Schools. We wish to offer our congratulations for reaching this milestone and look forward to their continued success working in LPS.
Thank you, Mrs. Keats. Any questions or comments?
Congratulations.
Congratulations, and have a good retirement. Oh, no, tenure.
Tenure.
Sorry, tenure.
Jumping ahead there.
Don't
Not
leave
yet.
us yet. Sorry about that. I moved ahead a little. Okay. We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Bonifield for teachers for tenure. Mrs. Acosta, will you take the roll?
Yeah. Mrs. Acosta says yes. Mrs. Bonifield?
Yes.
Bear with me one second. Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
President Bradford?
Yes, motion carries. Moving on to item 8C, leaves of absence. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford.
Mr. Johnson.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and approve the requests for a leave of absence as listed below. Julia Kubek, effective February 1st, 2024. Stacy Rosner, 2024-2025 school year. Seth Torkelson Reagan, April 18th, 2024.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Frank, for leaves of absence, and we're going to hear from Mr. Abadi.
Yes, thank you. The staff members listed in your documentation are requesting leaves in accordance with their collective bargaining agreement, and we ask that you please approve their leaves as presented.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mrs. Frank, for leaves of absence. Mrs. Acosta, will you take the roll?
Yes. Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, motion carries. Moving on to item 8D, resignations. That's for board information only, does not require a vote. So we will move on to item 8E, retirements. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Bonnefield.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolutions of appreciation for services rendered by Donald Boca, Patricia Wishmeyer.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for retirements, and we are going to hear from Mrs. Keats.
Hello again. Tonight, we honor and congratulate two members of our LPS family who are retiring from their positions with Livonia Public Schools, one very soon and one at the end of the year. As these staff members leave the district, they take with them a combined total of 51 years of experience. On behalf of the administration, I would like to thank our retirees for the dedicated years of service they have provided the students of LPS, and we ask the board to please adopt their attached resolutions of appreciation.
Thank you, Mrs. Keats. Any questions or comments? Mrs. Burton? Oh.
If I may, I have had the
Mrs.
privilege
Smith.
to be Miss Wishmeyer's supervisor. She works in the business office. She's been such a wonderful addition, just such a wealth of knowledge. If you've had the chance to meet her, you know what a loss she will be to our department. Such a wonderful lady. She's had a long history in Livonia, raised her children here, and has just been a dedicated employee. She's going to be greatly missed, but I do want to take this opportunity just to thank her for her service. She's definitely, like I said, going to be very much missed. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Burton?
I was just going to say, it's similarly, it's always bittersweet when we are voting on retirements. We appreciate these folks, and there are always some on the list that we know personally, as is the case tonight. And we're happy for the folks who are retiring. At the same time, we're going to miss them personally, professionally, and with all the knowledge and expertise they have with working with our whole team. In this case, directly with our students and in our finance department, which is no small department, to make sure that we're running to keep all of this afloat. So anyway, it's just with very much mixed emotions, but we are wishing you wonderful chapter of retirement.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Thank you, Mrs. Burton. All right, any other comments? We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for retirements. Mrs. Acosta, will you take the roll?
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, motion carries. All right, we're going to be moving on to item 9. 9A, we're going to move down till the end. We'll put that at the end if that's okay. So we're going to move on to item 9B, which is a second reading for board policy instructional programs, policy IHF, graduation requirements. May I have a motion, please?
President Bradford,
Mrs. Jarvis?
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the adoption of the read revisions of the board policy IHF, graduation requirements. The science requirements have been changed to provide students with different options in science.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading board policy instructional programs, policy IHF, graduation requirements, and we're going to hear from Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you, President Bradford.
You're welcome.
We have gone through our full cycle with this updated board policy. Essentially, there are some changes to grammatical areas, to names of departments, but the main reason we brought this to you is we wanted to change our science graduation requirement to provide students some more opportunities and choice. So we would like this policy to be changed from the requirement of 1 unit of chemistry and physics to what the state requires, which is 1 unit of science, chemistry, or physics, in addition to a 3rd year of science. So students still take 3 years of science. We just like to offer them some opportunities to take some different courses.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Are there any questions or comments? Mrs. Burton.
Mrs. O'Brien, I would just like to thank you and the whole department. I really appreciate the fact that we are giving our students this option, if it is consistent with the state of Michigan requirements, and that we're doing it so that it's effective as quickly as possible. I know we had those discussions in several meetings leading up to this one, but I think it's important for our kids, and as soon as we can offer more choices, I think it's better to do so, recognizing that a lot of our kids will still take both. And it's perfectly fine, and it's a fabulous choice for a lot of our kids. But for some that it may not be the best choice, I'm glad that we have options to give them some other choices.
I agree 100%. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Any other comments or questions? Okay, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the second reading board policy, instructional programs, policy IHF, graduation requirements. Mrs. Acosta, will you take the roll?
Yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta says yes. President Bradford?
Yes, motion carries. The next few items are first readings, so they do not require a vote at this point. So we're going to go ahead with item 9C, first reading of board policy, personnel, GBF, teacher placement. And we are going to hear from Mr. Abati. Thank you for the wave. Mr. Abati.
Yes, thank you. So as you all know from our previous sessions, we have a series of policies here that state law have changed on, which necessitated some adjustment here to make sure that we were in alignment with that. Would you like a full read aloud on these? I wanted to be certain. No?
I don't think that's necessary.
Okay,
no.
good. So the policy GBF is teacher placement, and I'm here for any questions that you may have. But it reads exactly as we have revised and gone through in our study sessions.
Okay, thank you. Anybody have any questions or comments regarding that board policy for teacher placement? Mrs. Oquist.
I would just say, just as a reminder, that these policies are all available under board book, under board meeting information. If anyone would like to read through, they are quite lengthy, which is why I think
Yes.
Mr. Abate and Mrs. Keats will not be reading through every policy, every administrative procedure, but we are very grateful to the board for the input you've given over the past several weeks on these policies. And again, as with all of our policies, they will remain on the board book for 2 months through both the first reading and second reading, if anyone is interested in reviewing them further.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Okay, then that will move us on to our next item, which is 9D, the first reading of board policy, personnel, GBG, staff reduction and recalls. And we are going to hear from, let's see, Mr. Abate again. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. So again, as you noted, this policy does revolve around a staffing layoff and recall of teachers. Again, it reads precisely as we edited in our session together, and I can answer any questions you may have.
Are there any questions from anybody? I know we discussed these quite a bit at the study session in the committee of the whole, so. All right, we will go ahead and move on to item 9E, first reading of board policy, personnel, GBIA, teacher evaluations. Mr. Abate.
Yes, thank you once again.
You're welcome.
So again, just it's a minor revision to be in line with the new state law regarding this topic, teacher evaluation. Again, no changes have been made beyond what we all worked on together in our last session. So again, any questions you may have, I'm happy to answer.
Are there any questions? Mrs. Frank?
I just wanted to thank Mr. Abate and his team for going through this. This was a lot of work, and I think Mrs. Oquist said that. We talked about this at length in several different meetings, and so we've all heard it several times, so we're not going over it again, but I just think it's so important how our staff is placed in all of these policies, and so they're vital policies to the district and to our staff. So it's not that we're not spending more time on it, it's just they're lengthy, and we've spent many meetings on it. And so I want to thank your staff, because it was a lot of work going through it and revising and changing and updating and making sure we're abiding by the laws and the updates as they change. So thank you so much. I really think it's vital. It's really important.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank.
Certainly welcome. We want to thank you as well. The ability, the time spent for all of you to pour through this and give us each of your perspectives as well. There are a lot of things caught and corrected for the better through that process. So thanks so much for that.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, President Bradford. I just want to make note that although we don't vote on the administrative procedures, and I know a lot of work has gone into the policies themselves, but I think even more work went into the administrative procedures that don't come before us for a vote. So there's a lot of, thank you for all the work that you put in on the policy, but more so on the administrative procedures, because that's the way the policies are implemented. And that's as important, if not more important, than the policy itself. So thanks again for all the work on that.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Okay, we will go ahead and go back up to item 9A, hearing from board members. Typically during our regular meetings, we have a section for any of our board members to share anything that they would like. Is there anybody that would like to share anything this evening? Wow, crickets, nothing tonight. Okay, all right. If we don't, oh, Mrs. Frank, thank you. Thanks for stepping up.
I would like to say thank you to our new officers who have joined the leadership of our board. Thank you so much for being willing to step in, to Mrs. Bradford and Mrs. Acosta to take on new positions. And thank you to President Johnson, Post-President Johnson, for your willingness to serve us well over the past year and many years before that. And so we're so grateful for that. And Mrs. Bonifield, who has been the study secretary for years and years and years. And so we're so grateful for your years of service as well. So I just want to say thank you for your leadership, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Mrs. Frank. Thank you. And I also want to put in a plug. Mrs. Burton's been president several times too. This is a kind of a new thing for us to be in these positions. So we appreciate all your support and mentorship in these roles, and we'll get them as we move along. So thank you very much. And is there anything, does anybody else have any business before the board? If not, then we're adjourned. Thank you and good evening.